So, where does the title come from? Turning the world upside down. Well, it comes from the book of the Acts, chapter 17, where Paul and Silas had been visiting Thessalonica, and the people weren't all that happy with what they had to say, and so there was a riot. And Paul and Silas and Jason, in whose house they were staying, were dragged before the people, and the accusation was made, these people who have turned the world upside down have come here. I want you to use your imagination. Tomorrow, when you're having your coffee and someone says to you, "What did you do at the weekend?" After you've got past the golf and all the other things you did, you reply, "I was with a radical revolutionary group." And their response will be, "So what, you've joined the Greens or the Labor Party or the Liberal Party? What do you mean you've joined a radical revolutionary group?" Because that's what the message of Jesus must have sounded like and caused people to say, he's turned the world upside down. And that's a worry for me, because in many ways the church has been reactionary. The leaders of the Ku Klux Klan in America tend to belong to a particular Christian denomination. The first people to accept Native Americans into their ranks, not the church, but baseball clubs. Civil rights, apartheid approved by some of the church in South Africa. And if I can use a word it's actually a swear word if you live in New South Wales, it's the word ecumenical. So Paul is in the succession of people who, like Elijah and Amos and Jeremiah and John the Baptist and of course Jesus of Nazareth, people who made the authorities unhappy and uneasy. How many commandments are there? Got that one? 10. Well done, top of the class. 10. But you know, there are 649 commandments of what you're allowed to do and what you weren't allowed to do, and many of them were negative. Jesus turns the world upside down and says, you can sum it all up into love God and love your neighbour. And he illustrated that by one of the best known of all the parables, the parable of the Good Samaritan. A Samaritan. To the Jewish people, he was an enemy. The Good Samaritan, he followed the law. It wasn't the same law as the other people. And he worshipped in a temple, but it wasn't the same temple as the other people. And he believed that he was part of God's chosen people, but he could not believe that God would have more than one group of chosen people. And Jesus says he was a foreigner who saved the life of a man whose own people had let him down. A single act of kindness against a whole history of againstness. I've seen that working out in my own life. For 19 years, my mother was basically confined to her home. And during that 19 years, people from her church came to visit her. once. Her next-door neighbour in 19 years came in on all but one of those days to see how she was. The problem was that Frank was a Catholic, and my mother had to rethink the whole of her theology because she'd been brought up, as I had been brought up, to be suspicious of anyone who had the name Catholic in their title. And a single act of kindness has the power to call into question a whole history of againstness. Professor A.J. Levine is a Jewish scholar, and she moves the story of the Good Samaritan to the West Bank. The man in the ditch is an Israeli, and a rabbi and a member of the Knesset come along and do nothing. And then a Muslim comes along and helps. So the neighbour is not the one who looks like you, or thinks like you, or worships like you. The neighbour is the one who showed you mercy and helped you when you needed it. Jesus is not focused on belief, but on action. Orthodox belief does not put a cup of water or put a meal on a table or provide a bed. Right belief doesn't change things unless it leads to right actions. The denomination to which I belong has an assembly meeting every year, and some years ago the first motion on the agenda was that we send our greetings to Martin Luther King Jr., assuring him of our support for him in his fight for freedom and for equality. And guess what? It didn't pass. You see, we were having some visitors from the United States coming to Australia to preach, and we didn't want to upset them. So forget about the way that the Afro-Americans are being treated. The man who's probably responsible more than anyone else for my being in the ministry was a man called Cliff. He was known in those days as an Eurasian. I don't know what you call him today, but he was a Eurasian. He graduated from theological college and he was sent to a dairy farming town on the north coast of New South Wales. And when he got there, he was sent home because they weren't going to have anyone whose skin was anything but white. I must say I never studied James when I was in college, but I know that James said it's not what you believe, it's what you do. Right answers are not worth the paper they're written on unless it takes flesh and blood and leads us to live a compassionate life. And perhaps there's something about us that is destined to challenge other people. Ask the man in the ditch who he believed would help him, and he'd have said the priest or the Levite. He certainly would not have said the Samaritan. And perhaps the only belief any of us needs is that of compassion. Love in action. Because love is the way that God acts towards us. Love is the way that God calls us to act towards others. And that has the power to change the world. Let me read to you two verses from the same Bible as you have in the pews. A blessing on the one who treats you as you have treated us. A blessing on the one who takes and dashes your babies against the rock. May those besieging me not win. May red-hot embers rain down on them. May they be flung into the abyss. May evil hound the men of violence to death. That's from the Bible. So is love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. And so today, as we move into Advent, let us remember that we have a God who is prepared to go on loving even to the end. Brenda Salter McNeil is an Afro-American of the evangelical kind. And someone said to her one day, people liked you better when you didn't speak about social justice and just quoted Bible verses. But one day she met with protesters. There was a police presence and an angry mob. And she knelt in the street and just prayed. And others followed. And she wrote, in that moment I felt the nearness of God in a way that I had never known from the pulpit. It changed my life. That day, Jesus came into my neighbourhood. Amen.